Hello, beautiful community members, and thank you so much for joining us again on Generational Archives, the show where we connect, heal, uncover through intergenerational conversations and archival research. And this conversation is an example of that. I'm talking with my mother. I'm Dr. Raina J. León, and I'm talking with my mom, Dr. Norma D. Thomas. Mommy, how are you going to introduce yourself today?
I'm going to introduce myself as being very happy to be here with you this morning.
Excellent. Excellent. I'm happy to be with you here as well. We've started this practice of beginning our show with a check in question, and this one is live. So the question is, what does reparations look like to you? Mommy, what does it look like?
Well, that's a very complicated question. And the debate is whether individuals who can claim ancestry from enslaved people should be given a monetary reparations as individuals, or should it go to communities? And so where it will do the most good. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question, except it would seem like if you are the descendant of enslaved people, the communities that those people came from should be able to dictate how best that reparation is awarded, used, given. And so I think it's such a complicated issue because what would be beneficial in one community might not work in another community. So it's complicated.
So, the premise for me asking this question is against the backdrop of right now in San Francisco, there are a number of proposals that are being considered within the city government, and one of them is around the possibility of a $5 million attribution to every Black resident of San Francisco, and as a part of their reparations movement. And that's received a lot of support. And then there are also people who say that would detract from the community. Let's not just focus on the individual. Let's think about larger initiatives that would actually attract and more Black people to return into San Francisco. So many people have been pushed out through gentrification measures and rising taxes and all sorts of things in the Bay Area, where I used to live for many years. And there's something to be said for that. Another part of me asking the question was, I'm a part of two collectives that where I'm learning a lot. One is the Earth Seed Project, which focuses on reparations explorations through creative practice. And then I'm also part of Black Water, which is an initiative from Jupiter Performance Studios led by Ebony Noel Golden. And that project is also considering reparations and climate justice and womanist practices to inform creation. So a lot around history and where are peoples from and what does this our current reading of the landscape and the landscape within indicate for the future. So that's the backdrop against which this question is arising for me. And of course, as we're talking a lot about our ancestors, and we are the descendants of enslaved Africans, as well as those who unfortunately kept our people in captivity. And that is hard to reckon, of reparations being so tied into our beginnings, the beginnings of our family.
Well, from I was sharing with Raina or reminding her that when my father died, I got a check from an insurance company, and it was specifically reparations for those penny policies that many
Mm.
African American people used to pay every week. There would be a white insurance man that would come to the house, and you would pay. We called them penny policies, but they were these small amounts. And my parents had policies on themselves, but they also had them on their children. They cashed in all of them once they were comfortable that we had our own insurance. But my one sister, they kept hers, and it was in force when she died. And under the concern that she might not have insurance to bury her. And it turned out they were so wrong because the work ethic that pervaded all of our experience also was her experience. And she had a policy, and she did leave money to myself and one of my nieces. But those penny policies produced the check that came for reparations, and that's what it was called. Also, I participated in the ERC project, and my specific project was called Reparations as Remembrance.
Yes.
And so the ability to take our memories and showcase them and explore them and honor them is a form of reparations as well.
And see, that's where I would go with reparations, that reparations is not just a monetary individual amount, although I think that it should be that too.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
And if someone does not want to receive reparations, they can always say, I don't want to receive this. I want this to go back into the community pot in some way. But I think that those who are the descendants of enslaved Africans should be able to receive some wealth that they can pass on, that we can pass on to our peoples, or just use right now for a really great vacation, whatever it is, but use it as this extended gift from our ancestors for the incredible labor that they were forced to endure. So I think that it should be individual. I also think that it should be community oriented, of like, there are incredible organizations like the East End United Community Center in Western Pennsylvania. There are community centers that have been deeply rooted and supportive of Black communities for so long. And I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter chapters across the country. I'm thinking about organizations that put bail forward for folks who cannot afford to get out on bail. And so poverty is the thing that is preventing them from their freedom. Give them some funds so that they can support people who also probably shouldn't be in jail in the first place. So there's that. And I think reparations looks like education, right? I look at the landscape with all these initiatives that are banning books, that are removing any discussion of Rosa Parks in connection with race. Oh, she made a choice to get up on the bus just because she thought that was the right thing to do. No, Rosa Parks was actually part of a long committed protest effort, because of racism. The fact that has been removed from a history book, that is the absolute opposite of what reparations should look like. Reparations looks like telling the full story. It looks like, and the full story also speaks to the humanity of our peoples. It speaks to resistance and humanization. It speaks to also the opportunity to rest. I would love for reparations to be like, I work for anybody who identifies as Black, to be like, I'm one of one in this predominantly white institution, and today I'm going to take a reparations day. I'm going to take a day of rest, and y'all are going to pay me my money because we've built that into the charter of this company, that I can take this day, and on that day that I have taken this day because I need it, you have clearly said something that has triggered my response to your racism. Everybody just takes a break and says, we need to do some work today. Clearly, we need to read a book and have some discussions because somebody is taking their reparations day. I want that to be a part of reparations. Maybe I'm moving too far, but I don't think I'm moving far enough. Is the reality. I'm curious for our listeners, what does reparations look like for you? So let's shift into our discussion for today. We're going to talk about cemeteries, actually our hallowed grounds. How we care for our dead is a reminder of how we care for ourselves too, and how we care for the future in the telling of their stories. So as we were gathering together, my mom was like, Mom, you were like, so what are we talking about today? And I said, okay, we're going to talk about the Thomas Cemetery. And the Thomas Cemetery, let's give the facts of it. What do we know about its founding, Mommy? Where did the land come from? What are the dates?
Well, the Thomas Cemetery was founded in 1913, and it was founded from land that was given for this purpose by Augustus Thomas. And the purpose was to have a place in perpetuity for the descendants of the Thomas family to be buried. And it's interesting. I don't know if Augustus Thomas knew he was dying, but he died that same year. So he would have been one of the first people buried in the Thomas Cemetery. The caretakers of the cemetery believe they know where his gravesite might be, but the marker is not clear. There are several of those very old markers that we don't know actually who is buried in those spaces, but we know from death certificates that that is where Augustus Thomas is buried.
And the land itself was granted or bought from family history from originally from George Washington. That is a story in the late 1700s or early 1800s, and then passed through different generations. There was more land that was bought from Moses Hopwood, if I remember
Moses
correctly.
Hopwood, Josiah Thomas, which is my side of the Thomas family. We often in Uniontown area talk about the different sides of the family, but the Josiah Thomas did buy considerable amount of land from Moses Hopwood, which is where the Thomas Cemetery is located in Hopwood, Pennsylvania. But there are also, we can see where Jacob Thomas at one point had 400 acres. And at one point, Hopwood was known as Thomastown. And so, older people would refer to Hopwood as Thomastown because there was so much land owned by the Thomas family. Now all that's left is the cemetery. So when I was young, I used to say, why are we out there in Hopwood? Why are people out there in Hopwood? And then later I realized it's because we used to own so much of the land out there. And that's where the final resting place for the Thomas family is.
And so, established as a cemetery itself in 1913, a part of the history, too, is that the Thomas Cemetery, which is a resting space for our family, a black family, also sold land to the Jewish community, which was established in the Fayette County and Uniontown area, Uniontown and Hopwood, in the 1830s to 1865. The records are a little different, but folks needed a place to bury their dead, and there's at least one instance of a huge a swath of land being sold to the Jewish community so that they could also have a cemetery right next door to the Thomas Cemetery.
And I have that deed where Augustus Thomas did pass that land over to the Jewish community, which means it probably might have been established before the Thomas Cemetery, because Augustus Thomas is the person on the deed that transferred that land. And you can see the Jewish cemetery from the Thomas Cemetery. They are that close together.
And in Uniontown, there are two additional historically black cemeteries, Clearview being one of them. Do you remember the name of the other one, Mommy?
The other one is it's commonly called Union Cemetery. Sometimes I've seen Uniondale. It was also referred to as Stony Lonesome, and that is right outside of Uniontown. Again, you'd have to know it was there to know it was there because it is totally overgrown.
Yeah, and so I was asking you just earlier about the founding of the Thomas Cemetery in 1913. We know the land originally, at least from the family story with Washington, was late 1780s to early 1800s. And so there's a huge swath, there's a lot of time in between. And we were thinking about, okay, so where would our people have been buried before that? Probably Clearview, maybe Uniondale, but Clearview itself has over 500 people interred there, including over 100 Civil War veterans. So a lot of history just within these three cemeteries within a pretty small community in Western Pennsylvania.
So not just Civil War veterans, because the history says that at least a third of the people buried in Clearview were veterans.
Veterans, yes.
Some Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II. So the last burial in Clearview was probably 1986, 87. My aunt was one of the last people buried in Clearview, but it's now beautifully maintained. And the episode following this one, we were talking about my father, who was a caretaker out there. But the Thomas Cemetery, as far as we know, has never gone into disrepair. And I say to family, that's something we should be very proud
Yes.
of, that over the history, that cemetery has always been maintained beautifully, and never was one that we had to lament the fact that you could not go out and visit your loved ones.
Yeah, and I have to celebrate that as someone who was able to go to the cemetery growing up. Of course, part of the times that I would go to the cemetery were to mourn someone who's just transitioned, right? And but the ability to, after that that celebration of their life and the community expression of hope for a life hereafter or their peace and their rest, but being able to, with family members, walk along the rest of the graves and see other family members interred together, see their dates, see how they were remembered, and to ask questions of those names who might have been from gravestones that have been there for a long time, and yet you can still see their names and think about, oh, well, this person lived a very short life, and why was that? Why is it that 1947 there are so many gravestones? Ah, now I know it's because of a tuberculosis outbreak in Uniontown and across the states actually, but it hit Uniontown very hard, and it's poignant because we started our podcast by talking about Uncle Francis, who also died in that year that impacted so many in Uniontown, and many within our family noted by that date of 1947. So, and there is also an attentiveness within the family, right, Mommy? Like people go out for Memorial Day to check on the graves, to check on the flags.
Memorial Day it was expected that you would go out actually the day before Memorial Day. So you would clean off the stones, you would make sure that your family members' gravestones were clean, that you would bring out flowers, that people would go out and cut the grass. You would bring out dirt for any of the graves that had sunk down. And so it was a ritual that when I'm in town, I go out to the stones and clean off everybody's stones. And if I can't get to all of them, I'll call my uncle and say, I didn't get to this stone. Can you clean off that stone? Do you have anything that might clean it off a little better? And on some occasions, it's been a whole celebration out there on Memorial Day with hot dogs and barbecuing and all kinds of activities. The VFW comes out and does a three-gun salute, firing the guns 3 times. We sing taps, or not, play taps. And in the past, there's been a history discussion so that people have an opportunity to connect with the past, and we are all out there communing with each other where we may not have seen each other since the last Memorial Day. And the expectation this year is the hot dogs are coming out, the grills are coming out, and we're going to get more back to what we used to do with Memorial Day, because I know that you're going to come to the question about the Thomas Cemetery now is run by a board of directors. It is a 501c3 organization,
So
C13 organization.
Why is that important?
Because 13 is cemetery. So why is that important? Well, it solidifies the ability to get donations to keep this cemetery going. It is very expensive to maintain a cemetery. And in the past, a lot of the money raised was coming out of people's own pockets. And they were very willing to do it. They did it for years. But now with the tax exempt status, we can hold fundraisers. We can make sure that people who cut the grass get paid, because before they didn't get paid for doing anything, even though a lot of this is still volunteer. I'm not going to negate volunteers at all because we would not be able to do what we do without the time of the volunteers. But there is now a board of directors. We try to get family involved, make sure that they know what's going on out at the cemetery, give them a voice in what is going on at the cemetery, and make sure that when we're not here anymore, that there are funds available so that the cemetery never goes into disrepair.
And I love that part of the story with the board making decisions is, should we cut these trees down? Should we put in new trees here? How much more should we clear? And
right now we have to put in a new fence.
Right.
We have to do stuff with the access road because the cemetery from the street does not look that big. But having walked every inch of that cemetery that is clear, because I think there's a little bit where it might go back where some of these older graves are, so it might not be so cleared. But generally, I've walked the whole cemetery in the sun thinking that this would take me a few minutes, and it was hours because I was noting and trying to make sure that the list I had matched every gravestone in the cemetery so I could add names if they weren't on the list I had. And that cemetery is actually quite large when you're taking the time to walk it. So the people who actually do the maintenance, it is a hard job.
Yeah. And so I wanted to talk about the Thomas Cemetery and also the tax exempt status, because how many of us, other than the times that our beloveds are interred, visit the cemeteries? What you've described of the Memorial Day experience is also quite joyous and celebratory, and folks are remembering together, folks who have transitioned, sharing history. So again, it doesn't belong just to one person. The memories are shared with everyone, and so they persist. And I think about, for me growing up, it was not unusual to make a stop at the cemetery, and that persisted even when my grandmother, Bobby's mother, my father's mother, transitioned. She's buried in Philadelphia. But when I got married, I made a stop by my grandmother's grave on the way to come back to the Bay Area.
And I think you left
I left my bouquet there.
Yeah.
And because I knew she would have been so proud to have been there, and she was. Because I got married for the second time anyway. With my husband and I had a more community focused wedding, and then we got married at her church, which I knew would have been significant for her had she still been walking among us. But I invite you all, listeners, to think about, how are you continuing your relationship with those who have transitioned? And how do you share their locations? How do you care for their graves? How do you care for their memories with your people? And whether they are, your children or others within the family, it is important to do that work. What you do for them, you hope that others will do for you. And
if you don't know where a family are buried, or if you haven't been there, this is an invitation to find out.
Right.
Because you should go. You should make sure that those grave sites are being maintained.
Yes.
And find out who might be doing work in the community to try to get those sites maintained. Establish a Facebook page. Do something. We were not a 501c13 until 2019, so it took us a very long time to make the decision to become this formal organization. But I think it is more important now than ever, because a lot of the older people who used to volunteer 100% of their time to maintain these sites are no longer with us. And that was part of the push for us to establish this 501c3, because one person, two of the people who were maintaining the cemetery were getting quite old. And so it was just not feasible for them to continue, we knew, much in the future, to be able to maintain this space. So what do we, as the quote-unquote younger people and people younger than us, what do we do to make sure that the experience that we had with this place of rest always being maintained continues because, family move away, people move away.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that there's a continuous funding source so that if we have to pay outside people to actually come in and cut the grass, we can do that. And that is part of our legacy. We have to look into the legacy. And with the money we raise now from public funds, we also have to be licensed in Pennsylvania to be able to do certain kinds of fundraisers. We are going to give our first scholarship. So the
Wow.
Thomas Cemetery will be giving a scholarship because if you raise money from the public, you have to demonstrate that the public benefits.
I love that idea that the ancestors are giving to the future through a scholarship. I love that. And I wanted to also bring up as what's coming up to me is that you should know about the practices of the cemetery and how if a person is interred for perpetuity or not, because in Uniontown, folks, once you are buried into the ground, you are buried in the ground. No one is going to disturb you. There's no additional fee that you have to pay other than the opening of the grave and so on. But in Puerto Rico, for example, in one cemetery where my grandfather was buried, that was not the case. There was a practice requirement that folks had to pay to maintain the cemetery. And it wasn't a big fee. It was every 2 years, $120 for the maintenance of the vault where your loved one could be. And the vault was big enough for up to 5 people. My grandfather was interred there in addition to another relative. But it was very much contingent on that fee being paid. And I remember years ago when we visited and my Tio Angel was telling us about that. And we were like, oh, that's interesting, but not really believing it. So the last time that we went, we saw in one area of the cemetery casket after casket after casket on top of one another. And
in a dumpster.
Essentially in a dumpster.
It was in a dumpster. And I said it's like Night of the Living Dead. There's these caskets that are in the dumpster, which means
that someone didn't pay the bill.
And
which isn't that big of a bill, but for me what was poignant was that with Puerto Rico in particular, with Hurricane Maria and Irma and like hurricane after hurricane after hurricane, people have moved. And so that bill has to go someplace. What if that place no longer exists, or the people have moved as part of diaspora, gone back and forth, and just didn't think about that one thing of putting in the forwarding address? The bill just didn't get to them or didn't get to them on time. And I thought about that as a possibility with my grandfather. And ultimately, our family gathered together and made the decision to reinter him, to move my grandfather from Puerto Rico to next to my grandmother in Philadelphia because of a worry for the generations to come. And I invite you all to think about, like, what are the rules around where your people are buried? And many of us come from diaspora and may not know what those rules are or who's taking care of the places where our grandmothers and great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers and great-great-greats and all that, we may not even know where they are, let alone who's taking care of that space. And I invite you, I think that the ancestors through me are inviting you to find out. So I think our time in thinking about cemeteries and the care for our dead has closed. But I also invite you, as you listen to this, we welcome your comments. If you like this content, like it and subscribe, share the news with other people. And again, I've said a gazillion times, when we reach back to the ancestors, 1,000 hands reach back towards us. And I truly believe that if you are listening, your ancestors are calling you, like I know our ancestors are calling us. Mommy, do you have any closing words for folks today?
No, just that we are continually grateful and happy that you're listening with us. Please like and subscribe. Ask us questions, comments. If there are things you don't like about what we're saying, please let us know that as well.
Absolutely.
And if you have ideas for future podcasts, let us know what they might be. Because if you're family members, maybe there's an area that you want us to concentrate on. So give us your ideas.
Excellent. See you next time. Or
Bye-bye.
listen to you next time. Bye.